And pray for us, please. For me especially, apparently.
Teach me, O Lord, the way of your statutes, and I will keep it to the end. Give me understanding that I may keep thy law and observe it with my whole heart. Lead me in the path of thy commandments, for I delight in it. Incline my heart to thy testimonies and not to gain. Turn my eyes from looking at vanities and give me life in thy ways. Confirm to thy servant thy promise, which is for those who fear thee. Turn away the reproach which I dread, for thy ordinances are good. Behold, I long for thy precepts, and thy righteousness give me life.
Man, thank you. So I wanted to just give a quick look at the email I sent yesterday, just in case it wasn't clear or you had questions or something like that. So next week, Tuesday night, I'm going to be here in Zoom from 6:30 to 7:30. I would, if you know you have something you'd like to look at together during that time, if you can email me that ahead of time, that helps a lot. But we'll see what comes up during that time together. Any questions about the email? Good. If you do, just ask by email and we'll be okay. Now, I always just want to keep this in front of us. What question, issue, or challenge can't biblical theology resolve? Then last week I had a chapel homily assignment, and I was thinking about you as I was going through that process. The assigned text is Malachi 2:13 through 16, and here is all of Malachi chapter 2. Francis, why do you suppose I put all of Malachi chapter 2 in front of me, even though I was only assigned 4 of the verses?
Because context is key.
Thank you. I didn't have time to start at Genesis 1, but I did at least get Malachi 2 verse. Yeah, good. And you'll notice, if you can follow my pointer here where the bold print begins, verse 13, this is the second thing you do. So you're only 6 words into the assigned text. And what do you have to do, Tyler?
Well, clearly you have to go back and find out what the first thing is you should do.
Exactly. What do you mean? What second thing? Let's go back and see the first thing that you do. Absolutely right. Thank you. Here we go. So this is typically what I do, and this works for Bible studies. It works for all sorts of things. It doesn't have to be just a homily. But I put the text in one column, and then I print a whole bunch of these, and then I start making notes over here. So these are just my notes, and I'll upload these slides so you can take your time. I don't want to work through them with you tonight. I just want you to show you that there's a process here of looking at key words, at how the text develops, right? And then looking at where this text sits in the whole Bible. So you see up here between Genesis 1 and Revelation 22, it's been 1,000 years since Moses wrote the law. So Malachi is 400 BC, Moses is 1400 BC. Okay, and then we've got something going on with treacherously, and I think it has to do with self-righteousness. And I thought of a couple of texts that have everything to do with this Malachi text. Okay, so Matthew 19 is the text where the Pharisees are testing Jesus. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? The mention of God desiring offspring from the union of a man and a woman, that takes us back to Genesis 38. Later, we'll remember Matthew 23 again, where Jesus is in confrontation with the Pharisees over there, essentially dealing treacherously. Then I wanted you to see on yet another piece of paper, I had these thoughts. And then later, thinking about it, I came down and started a new section. Here's some more thoughts. And then later on, another section, more thoughts. And then later on, more thoughts. Still trying to have the text imprint itself on me. I think that's the way to say it. Okay, so I'm explaining here different boxed off areas, notes that kept coming. D-Day, which was Thursday morning at 10:30 is coming. So it's always more tempting to package this text for delivery. So we ask God to not carry us along into that temptation. So keep reading, keep listening, keep waiting. I did come up with this outline, and it's not a bad outline, but before you, but you see, notice what I noticed. Below was a midterm draft of how to deliver the text. Okay, but I'm still waiting for the text to present itself. In other words, I think this is too much of me packaging the text rather than the text revealing its own package. Right? So see here, I had it all the way this far, and this would have worked, and it wouldn't have been non-textual, but it still bothered me that the of all of the words that are in this outline, it's taking us too far from the text. So I went back to the text again, right? And that on Thursday morning about 5:30 generated these notes from scratch. Just start out fresh. This is what the text is saying to me. And then about 6:15, this set came. And when this set came, then I knew this is it. This is the text doing the talking. And from 6:15 until about 1 minute before chapel, this was produced. So you can do this on your own time, but see what you think. I'd be interested in feedback. Okay. This is the first time I can remember that I've written a homily out word for word and read it word for word. And I think when you have a chance to read the content of it, you'll see why. Because I've been talking to you about using precise language, but because of the nature of what the text is speaking to, it was even more important. And guess what? I'm supposed to do this in 7 minutes. And I thought it would be helpful for you to know that after all these years, I was literally shaking as I was walking from my office to chapel, and I was still writing in hand with a pen on this text during the hymn before the homily. Not uncommon. Okay, so that's an archive for you to look at. Here's something else I thought up on a completely different note. Scott, can you read the black ink here?
What is the difference between throwing lit matches into a California wilderness in the fall, pouring a glass of water on a forest fire, and throwing lit matches into the ocean?
There, that's yours, Scott. That's an open question.
I guess these. Oh wow! The second one is you're not going to get any results, I guess. That's just going to be a waste of time.
Mm-hmm.
The third one, well, also no results. The first one, you'll get a lot of results.
Yeah,
but they're going to be undesirable results.
Well, Scott, would you say that people in the world around us are immersed in truth by natural and divine revelation, or are they more like in a wilderness, absent notions of truth?
The latter condition.
Right. And so what does it take to ignite the passions of the public in our culture?
Well, it doesn't take much. It takes one tweet.
That's right. Doesn't take much, right? Okay. And then if we think about folks who mean well and were rather traditionally raised as Christians, which means our contact with the living water is occasional, maybe every Sunday, maybe every other Sunday, maybe sometime during the week, but I wouldn't know why that would happen. So these folks have a glass of water or two with them, but what does it help when we think about the passions that blaze in the culture around us? So this is why I took the time to draw this ocean surface line here, where that green arc worldview, the kingdom of heaven lives here. And notice immediately how it changes. So anyone could throw any number of lit matches into this ocean. Doesn't mean a thing. What you have instead is a perspective that allows you to try and reach the person that's throwing the matches, or reach the people who are affected by the kinds of things that are said that are inflammatory in our culture. So it's another way that I was thinking about trying to encourage your life, your daily life, in the Word. Yes, just an image there. One more image in terms of a framework. So also thinking about the Word of God, that's the beginning of life, and so we like to start from here. Where does the Word begin, and what does it say to us? And that word is what supports life. That Hebrews chapter 1 passage is fantastic. Upholding all things by the word of his power. Hebrews 1 verse 3. And then in the other direction, remember our human ego tends to want to move in this direction, up and away and out. But the gravity of the law revealed in word and nature is protecting us from pressing out and away, and it's always there bringing us back. So we have the gravity pressing down, the gravity of reality and our limitations pushing us back into this place. I didn't put the arcs and the red pyramid in, but I think you're getting that by now. Just a way of thinking about God's activity in life. That brings us back to brings us forward to one more example. You see up here, the crucible is indispensable. Chloe, are you there? Chloe, what's a crucible?
Isn't it kind of like a pot or cauldron or something that you like melt metal in?
It's exactly right. Right. Good. Thank you,
Cool.
Chloe. Yeah. So crucible, and if you put the metal in the crucible, and Scott, this might be in your department. I don't know who else's departments, but if you heat the crucible hot enough over time, what happens to the ore, the metal that you put in it?
Becomes molten.
Is there any other effect besides liquefying it? Keep it hot.
Releases a lot of energy.
Isn't that how you purify metals? Burn off
You purify, burn off impurities. Yep.
It separates, it bifurcates. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so this is why a couple reasons why we want to pursue biblical theology and exegesis in the community of people, because that's the crucible part. I'll show you that in just a second. We also want to, I think I wrote this, it may be in the notes that I sent you for the final, right? But biblical theology and exegesis is never academic, and it's never separate from application, right? So we're like medics. We need to know what people need us to do for them, and we're learning that because we're going to be doing it for people. So this conversation, we don't want to be, we're back to the truth no matter what, right? And so I don't know if I have it right at this moment. What I know is that that's what we're all working on, and so we keep the thoughts that we have about the texts we're looking at, we keep them in the crucible, and the truth will remain. That's beautiful. That's a beautiful thing. Now, one of your classmates had a question about some of the things I'm writing, which was suggesting that I'm distinguishing the body from the soul to the point of separating them. And that's a legitimate point. I would not disagree with that. I am distinguishing to the point of separating. And this classmate's not the first person to raise that question with me, right? So let's, if we need to, answer the question with a little more precision. The body is still God's creation, though infected. And I think we have I said, I think, never mind that. It's likely that we have a good parable or parallel to that in what's been written about cancer and cancer treatment. So there is a theory that says we're all born with cancer cells. You come with them. And whether the cancer cells take you early in your life, sometimes even as an infant or in midlife, or whether you never are taken by cancer, it's still there, and it's a kind of a function of your immune system, whether it will take you or not. And if someone's treating cancer, like a surgeon, they can and must distinguish between the cancer cells and the legitimate or the actual cells. And I didn't know this until I did some reading about it, that, for example, liver cancer cells are identical to regular liver cells. The difference is that the cancer cells don't do anything for anything else in your system. They only take energy out of your system. So cancer cells ultimately kill you by robbing you of all of the other energies that are in you that are necessary to support your life. What a fantastic parallel, isn't it, to the way sin infects and the way it robs us of those functions in our life that were intended to give us life. I also mentioned that, so we could be careful here, that sometimes you have to, if you've been sailing, right, sometimes you have to lean a little heavy, right, in one direction in order to keep from going over. So in a culture like ours that's so preoccupied with this one-dimensional time-bound materialism, that's actually why I'm leaning so heavily away from that. And also interesting is that Luther did the same thing. One of the first things Luther wrote was a commentary on Galatians, and one of the last things Luther wrote was a commentary on Galatians. And if you read them both, you wouldn't believe they were written by the same person. So the first commentary on Galatians is very good message oriented, the grace of God, because Luther was trying to provide an antidote to the Roman Catholicism that burdened consciences in his time. Well, it worked. And then it worked so well that the people swung in the other direction and said, oh, good, since God's grace is so abundant, we can do whatever we want. And in so doing, just like that argument Paul makes in Romans, let us sin that grace may abound. Yeah, let's do that. So by the end of his life, Luther has to write a second commentary on Galatians when he's swinging back the other way and laying heavy on the law side of the Galatians text. So this is why, too, sharing biblical theology is an ongoing exercise, right? We're sharing it with people. We're listening to see what's happening, and then we're making adjustments all the time, right? Fine-tuning to help people come where the text intends them to. All right, picking up where we left off, Joseph, if I can hear you, and if you can see this slide, then...
And can you hear me?
I can hear you, and if you don't mind reading this first two paragraphs, because those are your words.
Oh boy, this is going to be... I never edit my stuff, so this is the first time I've read this. All right.
The Crucible.
Yes. The first thing that strikes me is how Paul comes out swinging. He claims the name above all names, who credentials him as an apostle. He adds, not from men, alluding to the methodology used by the wolves who've crept in. They drop names, but only of mere men. This theme of contrast will continue throughout the chapter. For instance, in verse 6, he mentions a different gospel and says something surgical here. The apostle says that some want to pervert the gospel of Christ. He doesn't say that the gospel has been perverted. For some reason, I think that's important to note, but it leads me to a rabbit trail question. What would have to happen, and what would it look like if the Judaizers were successful and the gospel had been perverted? It has never stopped happening. Oh, those are your words, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And
It has never stopped happening. What is CF, Professor?
Reference.
Reference every religion and denomination except one.
Okay. You can go back to your words now.
Okay. In verse 11, Paul mentions that the gospel he preaches has also been revealed to him, like his appointment to the office of apostle by the Lord himself and not of men from Jerusalem or elsewhere. In verse 16, Paul again reveals some of his anthropology by stating he didn't at first consult with flesh and blood. Instead, he let what God had revealed to him grow within him. Yeah, the crucible. And for 3 years meditated upon it in the desert regions. Only after that time did he return to Jerusalem to confirm with Peter and others what the Lord had taught him.
Okay, good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And so, friends, these slides have that same red ink that I put in the first set of slides from your classmates. Whatever is personal reference, I put in red ink because we're trying to abandon the ego in favor of the objective text.
Red for welt.
Whatever works is good. Okay. Now, let's do a little bit of analysis here. How Paul comes out swinging. Now, if we can always practice moving to being as literal and textual as possible. Joseph, what are you referring to in particular by the phrase "come out swinging"?
Well, he comes out immediately with his credentials, like an officer walking onto the deck of a ship with his credentials all over the front of his uniform. You know he's the man in charge. So he comes out with Christ. Christ appointed me. I am the apostle. He's coming on deck with so he's coming out swinging in the sense that he's credentialing himself immediately.
Okay.
There's no normal, it doesn't seem like there's a normal, he's not as jovial as he normally is.
Okay, friends, you hear what Joseph just said, is breaking a pattern, right? If you read all the other 12 epistles of Paul, does he ever start with this much focus on his credentials? That's a good way to say it. Okay, now, where else could we look for reasons why Paul's doing that? Where would be the next obvious place to look for what's going on in Galatia?
Sorry.
I'm sorry, say it again.
I was going to say maybe wherever, I want to say it's in the book of Corinthians, but didn't he run into this with the issue of baptism too? Isn't it similar? Some are baptized into Apollos, some into Paul. I mean,
okay, good. No, 1 Corinthians 1 is a good clue. So there were divisions within the Christian community that had to do with what's the right word for it? Like superhero followers. Okay, we're going to turn Paul into a superhero, or Apollos into a superhero, or Christ into a superhero. We're going to distinguish ourselves, and we're going to claim some kind of priority on the basis of who we follow or who baptized us or something like that. Yeah. Did any of you think of Acts? Paul's writing to the Galatians. Okay, so what Galatians? So let's go hunt that. If you look up in the concordance, you'll find Galatians, and chances are Dr. Young usually does this. He'll put a little note in at the beginning that gives you kind of an explanation. So Galatia is a region. It's not a city. Southern Galatia is a region of smaller city-states or cities that Paul traveled to during his first missionary journey, Acts 13 through 15, right? Okay. So the next thing we would do probably is stop. Look at this. We're only half a verse into Galatians, and we have to stop and go back and read 3 chapters of Acts, right? What's going on? We might want to keep reading, because what Acts 13 through 15 is going to show us is that one of the methods of the Judaizers. Whoops, stop again, put another quarter in the meter. We have to, what's a Judaizer? Alex, they're known by another name, but you could just describe what a Judaizer is.
Is it a Pharisee?
They are numbered among the Judaizers. It's not exclusive to the Pharisees. Look at the basis of the word Judaizers.
Are they? I mean, they're Jewish.
They're Jews, and what about them? Yes, Anna.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in too soon.
No, that's everybody. We're all helping.
No,
that-
you can save me.
Were
It's fine.
they were they also called the party of the circumcision or
The
is that somebody else?
circumcision party. So you know that little jingle, right? Ain't no party like a circumcision party.
Sounds like a terrible party.
It's good for middle schoolers. They love that kind of thing. Okay. So now if I don't know what the circumcision party or what they're about, I could go to Young's, right? I could look up circumcision and circumcising, and I would start with Acts. I wouldn't start with Genesis or Leviticus. I'd start with Acts. And what you'll find is they insisted that a person had to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses if he was going to be saved. Right now, of course, Jesus exploded all of that. But think about the context, right? That Paul is persuading Jewish people not only to recognize the fact that Jesus is the Messiah, so he's the one we've been waiting for. You don't need to wait for any, there's no one else coming, but also the import of what that means. In other words, the law of Moses that was peculiar for the Jews and very exceedingly ceremonially law-based had been fulfilled, and therefore relief came. And so in Acts 11, but then you hear it again in Acts 15, you get to hear Peter, and then in Acts 15, James, the brother, half-brother of Jesus, articulate this very clearly. So Peter responds to the Judaizers' argument, the circumcision party's argument, by saying, why do you lay a yoke, a burden on the neck of the Gentiles, which neither we nor our fathers have been able to bear? Which was the purpose of the Mosaic law, to prove to the human ego that you cannot do what your life depends on. Now, second thing, by way of parallel, in our own experience. So Joseph notes that these Judaizers are trying to discredit Paul. You'll see them in Acts, you'll see them following Paul from city to city to city, right? Trying to undo the work that Paul has done in conveying the good message to people and people believing it. Okay. It's not hard to ruin a person's hope of being elected to public office, is it? All you have to do is what?
Plant a seed.
And what seed?
A bad one, a bad seed, a bad
Now,
a weed.
Well, let's be precise in our language, right? It's not that you're going to tell the population or prove to the population that the candidate is incapable.
Plant a lie then.
A lie. All you have to do is discredit, right, the candidate, and then it's over. It doesn't even matter once that's done if all of the evidence points that the accusation was a lie. It doesn't matter. It's too late once it's into public opinion. And so you'd be, well, maybe you wouldn't be surprised, right, that the more effective a servant of the Lord is in the service of the Lord, the greater target that person might be, right, to be the subject of accusation, right? Which is why it's all the more important, and the New Testament urges us to think this way, that our lives be above reproach, not sinless, but above reproach. We live our lives out in the open, right? That kind of thing. So all of that, however much time that took, just to work our way through figuring out what Paul's doing in these first few verses. Why, as Joseph said, he comes out swinging. Second thing, let's just start with a different gospel. What does Paul himself say in Galatians 1? Let me take you there, about whether or not there is a different gospel. So, verse 6, turning away so soon from him who called you in the grace of Christ to a different gospel. Read on. Is there a different gospel? No. Which is not another, but there are some who trouble you and want to, keyword, pervert the gospel of Christ. This is another place where you might pause. Yes, I think I'd like to see not just what exactly that word means, but where else it shows up, right? And then to punctuate the magnitude of what we're talking about here, even if we are an angel from heaven preach another gospel to you, then what we have preached, let him be anathema, accursed. Very important word, yes? How many times does the word accursed show up in Galatians itself? Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. Cursed is everyone who doesn't abide by everything written in the book of the law to do them, right? If you are going to effectively make void the good message, then the blessing of Christ, which was promised to Abraham and others through history, if that blessing is removed, where does that put us? We're back under the curse because we're not keeping the law, and we can't and we won't. Okay, so back to different gospel. Is there a different gospel? Let me come back here. Okay, so what would happen if the Judaizers succeeded and the gospel had been perverted? And this is where I was suggesting it's never stopped happening, has it? It started happening with Adam. If that thesis about Genesis 1 and 2 is correct, that Adam changed the gift of God's instructions about creation by inventing a law that had nothing to do with why God instructed Adam the way he did. And then it goes on and on and on from there, right? We get to the New Testament where the Pharisees invented how many new laws? 613. And what became of God's law because of that, right? And Jesus in his tangling, sorry, that's not accurate language. Jesus in his confrontation with the Pharisees identifies that problem, right? The Pharisees were teaching the people that if you do things according to the law of the Pharisees, then you're bound. But to do things according to God's design or God's law, that doesn't matter. You don't have to honor your father and mother by taking care of them if you give what you would have given them to us. So there you can see that working. Well, one of the things you learn as you study world religions, and philosophies could be included, is that they're all identical when it comes to the moral law. And why is that? Because it's obvious, it's inescapable. Why is murder wrong, or stealing, or defaming another person, or adultery? You know, even the first commandment, even if you claim to be atheist, okay, you're still not the God of your own existence. And so if you serve something or someone else as if that was the source of your life, you will die. Okay, the only religion and denomination that has this gospel that Paul proclaimed is what we call Christianity X, or biblical Christianity, that says God has already saved you, and the conversation goes on from there. So that's the until you're out. Unless Anna and I still need to make an appointment, unless she succeeds in burning me up in the crucible, we're still going to see if that works. Okay, now something else. An assignment that I give to the world religions students is to argue whether Paul's claim that there's no other gospel is accurate or arrogant. And it's proven to be a good exercise, because what it reveals is that these students don't actually check to see what Paul means by gospel here. And this is where we get back to an example of making assumptions about the way we read into texts from our own ideas or ways of thinking about things that have nothing to do with what the text is actually saying, which again is a danger of using English dictionaries with English translations and thinking that we're getting to the actual meaning of the word. And we'll have a couple of examples of that yet tonight. So the majority of the time, more than any other, students assume that gospel means a religious text. Well, of course, then that's ludicrous. Why would Paul even say there's no other religious texts? He knows very well there are other religious texts, so that can't be what he means. Or gospel as religious teaching. Well, of course, every other religion has religious teaching. That's what religions do. Almost never, but it has happened a couple of times. A student recognizes that good message, as defined by the Bible itself, it won't tolerate a free will. It won't be confined to a one-dimensional worldview. Actually, is a good message, right? That's where you start with the iceberg model with the 15 aspects of what the good message says, and all of those aspects surround us and precede us and are effective in all God's activity, just like the life of an infant in a womb. Now that's a good message, right? You're not going to be held responsible for meeting some metric that God imposes on you. Jesus met all the metrics, right? Okay, so one way to expose whether someone is talking about law or gospel is to use this metric on it. So when apologies in advance, Anna. So when Anna says to me, so what about John 3:16? God so loved the world that whoever believes in him, see, it says believes in him. And then my response to Anna is, and how do I know if I believe enough? How do I know if my belief is strong enough? How do I know if my belief is accurate enough? How do I know that I'll actually be in this state of believing when I die or when other things happen to me? So you end up with all of these questions that I don't have answers to. But if faith, belief, and trust are describing the relationship of a person who is non-contradictory, right? The only thing I have to say is to let God do the talking. Whatever God says, that's how it is. Then where there's no measure of that, just that's honesty doesn't have a metric. You're honest or you're not, and that's same thing with coming to rest. Same kind of idea. Okay, questions before we move into Galatians 2 and Matthew. Okay. By the way,
maybe not a question.
yeah,
Oh,
sure. Yeah,
do you mind if I say something real quick, Dr.
want you to
Just a thought on that question of, well, how do I know I believe enough, or something to that effect? When students have asked me that, I tend to say, well, if you're wondering whether you're saved or not, that's a sign that you do have faith.
Mm-hmm.
So just a thought.
And that is a question. We could suspect that question can be generated both by the ego or by the soul, right? Where the ego wants to, okay, come on, give me the standard and I'll keep it. That's all I want to know, just so make sure I have the standard right. As opposed to a regenerate soul that says, I don't think that this will work for me to be meeting the standard, right?
It's still super subjective. It's still, I mean, that's a great answer, and I think it's a fantastic answer on the fly, but it's still really highly subjective, you know. I did have a question, Doctor. I did have a question, Doctor.
Yeah, Joseph, please.
Well, when we talk about perverting the gospel, I've been having a conversation with a Baptist fellow at work, and he's always mentioning the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and how there's a different program for the Jews and a different one for the Christians. And, you know, in light of this, see, he's not viewing the Christian gospel is perverted, but I think there's something to the scope of the gospel that makes it the gospel. So when that's a perversion in a new kind of way. It's pretty insidious, don't you think?
It's absolutely insidious, and maybe at least one kind of, well, two starting places, of course, would be Galatians, would be a great starting place. Romans is another, where Paul is dealing particularly with the Jewish opposition. But as far as the Old Testament, New Testament being different and the way things work are different, Hebrews actually, that's what the letter to the Hebrews is doing. There's all these notions about what our lives depend on. Our lives depend on Moses. Our laws depend on the Mosaic law. They depend on angels and angelic intervention. They depend on rituals and sacrifices and a whole long list of things. And what Hebrews is doing is going through those items one by one and saying, when did the Bible say anything about Moses or the law like it says about Christ? Where's the angel that was called the Son of God who created the world? Where's the animal sacrifice that began to do what Christ did once for all by sacrificing himself? Yeah, and so this is again where biblical theology is swimming in the living waters, begins to, the currents, if you will, if I can use that metaphor, the currents will take you to the places that provide the answers you need. Similarly promised by Jesus, right? Don't worry about what you're going to say when the time comes. The Holy Spirit will bring to mind where the solutions are in the Bible itself or in nature. That's also revelation. Yeah. So how do you know if a baby is at rest in its parents' arms? Well, I don't know. It's not moving. Right? Eyes closed, deep breathing, not moving. Right? It gets very different when they're two and they won't stay in your arms. They squirm and squirm and arch. Have you ever seen a little kid arch their back? It's really hard to hang on to one of those creatures when they're arching their back. Okay. Onward, Galatians 2, and that would be Matthew, the black ink, please.
Let's see, reading Galatians 2, verse 8 jumps out at me as almost out of place, justified by faith. So it says, we ourselves are Jews by birth, not Gentile sinners, yet we know that a person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. So that we have also believed in Jesus Christ in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by works of the law, because by works of the law, no one is justified. But if in our endeavor to be justified in Christ, we too were found to be sinners in Christ, is Christ then a servant to sin? Certainly not. For if I rebuild what I tore down, I prove myself to be a transgressor. For through the law I died to the law so that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not nullify the grace of God for its righteousness, or through the law, then Christ died for no purpose. And I may have to modify a little bit because I've kind of had some different thoughts as I've gone through this, but I'll read what was on the screen, then I may add a little bit to it if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
I'm left wondering what we are able to build up that was torn down. The premise seems simple. When we are in Christ, we are not held to the law because the law accuses and condemns us. So why do we still die? It is our sinful nature, Romans 6 and 7, that lead us to continue to sin. I think this refers to the old Adam that rebels against God, and I can understand that. But did we tear something down, or did God? And I would add to it, as I was thinking about it this past week. I was trying to get some notes that kind of an interesting thing I was thinking about really was, so really what jumped out at me was verse 18. For what I rebuild, what I tore down, I proved myself to be the transgressor. So initially I looked at that and it just seemed it seems out of place almost in my mind to be talking about being justified by faith. And then suddenly it's like, if I rebuild what is tore down, I prove myself to be the transgressor. And so initially I looked at it and said, okay, I think it's a bit of a I forget what word I was using when I talked about it, but what I read it as saying on one hand is, since if Jesus, as the one who tore everything down, if he was to be the one who rebuilt it, he would be the transgressor. But he's not the one who is rebuilding that sinful nature in us. That would be the sin that dwells in us. And then a secondary thought that I had as I read this and was reading through Romans 7 is that Paul spends time talking about how, for him, sin is a foreign entity to himself, right? He says, I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but the very thing I hate. And he says, for I know that nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh, for I desire what to do is right, but I'm not able to carry it out. So I almost looked at it and said, it proposed a question to me. And my first blush reading this was that Paul's saying in this one, well, if I, as the sinful man, prove myself to be the transgressor, but I almost would now, I'm kind of getting to the point now where I think I'm convincing myself that Paul's not even saying that he's the transgressor, but it's actually the sinful nature that is foreign to our body is the actual transgressor that is trying to rebuild itself. And so that is what I guess we need to be aware of and kind of deal with, is that there is a nature to us that is continuously trying to rebuild itself. The concupiscence or original sin, whatever the philosophical term is what's trying to rebuild itself, but that it's fighting against God itself.
Okay, good. Thank you, Matthew. So working on your question with you, and notice in verse 18, who is the subject of the verb, the rebuilding and the tearing down?
He would say, I think he's saying so he's saying Paul himself.
Yeah, this is Paul who would be, he's not, but he would be, if he was going to argue that we're justified how?
By our own works, our own action.
By works of the law, right? And we know from the history, so this is why down here, not a word meaning question or a grammar question, but someone's character and history question. So here we are. We're going to go back to Acts again and track the life of Paul, right? We're going to meet him first at the stoning of Stephen, and then we're going to meet him, it was just for a minute at the beginning of chapter 8, and then we're going to meet him again in Acts 9, where the Lord meets him on the road to Emmaus. But something larger than that, something more overarching. Have you ever noticed that Peter is at the center of the narrative in Acts from chapter 1 through chapter 7? We're introduced to Paul just for a minute in a couple of verses at the end of 7 and beginning of 8, and then we get the narrative of Paul's conversion's the wrong word because that never happens, the regenerating of the life of Paul by the Lord. And then we're back and forth between Paul and Peter from Acts 9 through 15, and then there's nothing else about Peter. Then it's Paul all the way going forward. Okay, that's one thing. So Acts is focused on two different people. Next thing about Acts, what you notice is, and let me take a step back, because this is where sort of you never know what you learn about how things work in God's creation, how that will apply to understanding texts, sort of like how cancer works. I learned from a person I knew about ship architecture. There's two kinds of ship architectures. One kind of architecture is a ship that is all over the place in the water, but unsinkable. The other kind of ship is a ship that doesn't move very much in the water, but if you tip it, it will tip over. And there's, of course, different applications for both architectures. So think about Peter and Paul. We already know from the Gospels that Peter is all over the place, right? He confesses that Christ is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, and then he tells Jesus there's no way you're going to suffer and die as the prophecies say that Christ will. Get behind me, Satan. Okay, and the rooster crowing, and on and on and on it goes. Okay, the same thing happening in Acts is that Peter was playing the hypocrite when the Judaizers showed up in Antioch. Paul references it in Galatians 2 here, and it's there in the text of Acts. Okay, and then there's the whole Cornelius event, which is particular to Peter, and you'd think if you read the narrative in Acts 10 about Peter and Cornelius, that would have done it. That should be it, and yet it wasn't. And so what we might conclude is that Acts follows Peter through chapter 11, where Peter makes a very clear witness about how the good message works, and then he does it again a second time in Acts 15, both Jerusalem councils, and then we don't hear anymore from him. Sort of like, I know we were all worried about Peter's longevity as a faithful witness and apostle, but he's there now. But it took some time, and it was a wavy ride, because Peter still had that self-righteous piece working in him. Do you remember on the roof of the house in Joppa, and the sheet comes down and the voice says, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat"? Does anybody remember what Peter said?
I can't, these are unclean.
Yeah, I've never eaten anything common or unclean. Do you really want to play that card, Peter? After the rooster crowed, after get behind me, Satan, after sinking in the Sea of Galilee, but you can sympathize.
He's at least consistent.
He's clinging to this last little thing that I got right according to the law. Now, think about Paul. Paul was confronted with the Lord of those people whom Paul was persecuting, physically, murderously persecuting, and his life is spared. Do you think that Paul knows if our relationship with God ever moves back under the law, where does that put Paul? See, where Peter might still say, "Oh yeah, sure, no problem, because I don't eat unclean things," Paul's going to say, as soon as we're back in the courtroom, I'm under condemnation. I can't, there's no talking my way out of that. There's no number of the 613 Pharisaic laws that are going to excuse me for that one. So this is why, Paul is 100% against the church until the Lord regenerates his soul, and he's 100% in favor of the church, partly because he can't risk stepping out of the good message. And if we're honest with ourselves, we're all the same way, aren't we? I don't want to go back under the judgment of the law. Do you? Any of you on Judgment Day say, whoa, there's this thing that I always got right. Never cheated on a test, or I never back-talked my parents, or Derek, welcome in. He's looking for his here.
Yeah, thank you. Got done a little bit early, so.
Did you fly that big jet?
I did, yeah. So long and the short of it, I had Tel Aviv trips all summer or all fall, and I went non-current for landing, so they sent me down in the simulators. I get a couple landings to get back current. It's obviously not flying Tel Aviv at the moment, so.
Okay, and are there any laws involved in what you have to accomplish, Derek?
Yes, yeah, we have to have within 90 days, we need to have 3 takeoffs and landings to have minimum currency.
Yeah, I was baiting you, Derek. I mean, your work is full of the law.
Full of laws, yes, it is.
Okay. So one more thing before we take a break, but to spend a little more time in what Matthew is working on here. But you do see that the ego is forever wanting to rebuild itself, right? There's still something about me that I want to argue, something that's worthy, something that deserves to have its own way, all those sorts of things that get in there and make trouble for us. One last thing is this, and look for emphasis in the text. How many of you noticed that in one verse 16, the same comparison is being made, and more than once? So let's count them. A person is not justified by works of the law, but through faith in Jesus Christ. So we have believed in Christ Jesus in order to be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law, because by works of the law, no one will be justified. Could I say it any more plainly? If any of you read the Athanasian Creed, there's no wiggle room in that. I'm just going to say it all the times, and then you have to be there. So part of it's personality. What do we know about Paul as a person? Part of its history. What was going on between Paul and the Galatians, between Paul and Peter and Antioch? What's going on in the whole book of Acts between Peter and Paul? Or getting to know these people, getting to know their character, and learning a lot about them. By the way, you might remember Simon, son of who? What was Simon Peter's father's name? Yeah,
Jonah.
Jonah. That's not irrelevant, right? Peter was very much like Jonah of biblical narrative. Okay, friends, let's take a, sorry you just got here, Derek, but we're going to take a break, but not a long one, 4 or 5 minutes, and I'll see you right back here, and we'll go on with Francis. Warm that up again for you?
I think I'm okay, thanks.
That's the best news I've heard all day. Okay. Okay, welcome back, friends. And there's your cameras coming back on. Excellent. There it is. One thing I didn't mention before we took a break, but in what Matthew had to share with me was this note about the word that's translated transgressor. And Matthew, your instincts were right about, I think I'd like to know more about that word. Matthew, what's the SBL and Holmes SBLNT edition?
That's part of our that was part of our logos package. That was the Greek New Testament not translation, but I get what is it, the concordance that came with it? Not concordance, but
is it notes?
It's the Greek, like it's the Greek translation of it that then gives us the words that go with them. I don't know I can't think of the right words at the moment to say, but it essentially gives you all the Greek words side by side, so you can see what the actual Greek is.
Oh, it's it's an interlinear.
Yeah, like an interlinear. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
So that was what I was using to then find the word in Greek and then click through it to figure out what what actual words were that were with it.
Okay, good. And beware. So an interlinear could give you a shortcut in Young's Concordance if it gives you the word right where you're studying, and then you can go right to the index in the back of Young's, and you don't have to get a King James version to see what English word it used. So you can find it in the body of the concordance and then see what the original word is, and then go to the back. But you see, I saw the one red flag I saw in here is after parabates up here, this phrase in secular Greek. So Matthew's quoting, I think you are right here, Matthew.
Yes, that was a straight copy out of the.
Yeah. See, this makes me nervous right away. Because not that the New Testament, like the Old Testament, not like that, not as if it's on some other planet using Koine Greek or Hebrew, some other foreign place that has no relationship whatsoever. But we want to be careful to let Scripture interpret Scripture and not. We just need to be careful. Sometimes, right, there are words in Old Testament and New Testament called hapax legomena, which means legomena is a word that only appears once in the Bible. Okay, what choice do you have but to see where else in literature about the same time this word might occur? So you could go into other places and look, and I think I have a note on that here. Let me just make this go forward there. So I did some checking on what Matthew had to say, and here's this transgressor number 8, the left hand picture, right hand column, number 8 transgressor, parabates. One thing you can know about is this Liddell Scott, this is an in-print version of, I think, what you have in Logos. You have lots of electronic versions of other lexicons and study helps and so forth, and that's a great thing to be aware of. But the research that I did informed me that the root of this word transgressor, so para is a preposition, the BAT, or just the BA, is at the root of this thing, and it's the word for measure, which is where you would get transgressor out of this, right? I prove myself a transgressor, in other words, a person who's out of sync with the measure of things. So all that to say, it was good for Matthew to do some logos searching, to do some thinking about it. We need to keep working on that to see, because obviously words for doing wrong are abundant in the Bible, right? So if we don't have much to work with in transgressor, start with Galatians. What other words occur in Galatians that mean the same thing. Paul's talking about what's wrong with us, right? And then we can expand from there. So you end up with a list of words. Francis did something like this having to do with baptism, right? You start with baptism, but then you keep growing and growing and growing this list of words that intersect with that.
And I do need to clarify actually that I went to that other version, the Greek version. It also did bring me into the theological dictionary of the New Testament. That's actually where that comes from. That's the Kittle. So that's actually a copy paste straight out of Kittle, not the Greek translation. Yeah. So I had to follow my own clicks through to see how I went from the English to the Greek, then to the dictionary. So
nice. Okay. Yeah, good. Thank you. That's helpful for me to know too, because Kittle is the dictionary that has the root word with other augments, prepositions attached. So you would know where else to look for that word in other forms, which you wouldn't necessarily know otherwise. Okay, thank you, Matthew. Francis, please.
So Galatians 3, verse 28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. Some use this verse to, oh, it left.
Well, I just put the verse up there, but okay.
Some use this verse to justify either women's ordination or more recently transgender issues, or to say, look, there is no such thing as gender. How do we make sense of gender as a non-issue here, but gender and corresponding roles are distinct in other places like Ephesians 5 or 1 Corinthians 11? I propose that context, considering the original audience and the topic being addressed, will resolve any tension here.
Good, thank you. We could, I think, see, I'm doing it. What if we replace self-references with the phrase, what if? What if that context that's collaborative, it's modest, it's not egocentric, and I need to work on it too. Yes, exactly, Francis. Consideration of the original audience and topic resolve the tension. Absolutely. New problem. People will say that was then and this is now. Now what, Francis?
I don't know that I understand that entirely, because when I say original audience, like if you were to take any of like the text messages on my phone and try to apply them to you or to someone else, it doesn't work. Like you need to understand who I was talking to and why we were having that conversation. So that's not a then and now, that's a helping to define your terms in the conversation by who's receiving your message.
Okay, then I'm going to come back and say the then of it was that this was a culture that was bogged down in gender issues, and we are not that culture anymore. So it's like Paul was preoccupied with all kinds of gender stuff, and especially because he was male, and this was a patriarchal society, and the males dominated. That's why Paul is all about this, what men can do and what women can't stuff. And now we know that that's wrong. Okay, now what?
I would counter that people keep inventing more and more genders, so I don't think we're less than that. I think we're kind of amplifying the issue.
Okay, well, one thing that's interesting is in the last, probably 100 years now, in the last 100 years, there has been a growing movement for women to be self-assertive, to bring out into the open inequalities and abuses, and to be granted the same access to all of the same kinds of activities and privileges and so forth, equity, as men. Okay, so if we think about that was then and this is now, if then was different, then why is Paul talking about it? So what the text suggests is that men and women were having the same kinds of conflicts over who can do what then as they are now, except that the institutions weren't as willing to change as they are now. And what if the institutions are willing to change now because they don't actually understand the significance or the nature of the relationships, which is why we spent so much time in Genesis when we got started, right? Let's see. Oh, yeah, so method here. So Francis, if we were going to pursue this, because we need to, we're going to have 300 people from church in Sunday school this coming Sunday morning, because they're all interested in what the Bible has to say about this. What's our method for preparing to share with them what the Bible has to say with gender, non-gender, and all those sorts of things?
So I think perhaps considering the original audience, he's naming different groups of people that tried to prioritize themselves over one another. So the Jews are better than the Greeks, men are better than women, and so on. And what Paul is saying in the kingdom of God, that's just not a thing.
Mm-hmm. Good. And can we, by way of similar kinds of conversations, can you think of any that Jesus has? Or if we were going to pick key words, where could we hunt in the New Testament?
Well, because we just did it in my class, when the disciples are asking who's going to be greater in the kingdom of heaven, and Jesus is like, that's the wrong question. Or when Jesus holds up the Samaritan woman, your faith is great. He's constantly inverting what's expected within the kingdom of heaven.
Yes, and as far as marriage and who can you marry, who can't you marry, and with the 7 brothers and the 1 wife, and then Jesus says, well, that's how it works here in physical world, in time, and for good reasons. But in the kingdom of heaven, we're not worried about that anymore. So, by way of parallel, if we were in a theater production, and who haven't I picked on? Tyler is the villain. He's cast as the villain. Can we, as fellow thespians, still be friends with Tyler after the rehearsal, or do we all hate him now?
For the length of the production, we should be mean to him until we're done. Just to get the method right. So yeah, we'd stay mean until the end.
Okay, good. Think about this. If Tyler stays a villain 24/7, then there's a problem with Tyler, yes? And if he doesn't, but we treat him like a villain 24/7, then there's a problem with us. And it does matter that Tyler stays the course in the production for the sake of the point. We're assuming that this is an important point that the production is making, right? So let's go back to something else Francis was interested in, the human nature, the body. The body is integral to every human being. How do we know that? Well, first, God created it out of the dust of the ground and kept on creating it. Second of all, it is the medium through which all the rest of everybody comes, right? We don't generate souls independently of bodies. It's a package. Third, the Son of God, the Creator himself, takes human nature. And do you suppose that was just a lucky coincidence? Like Jesus, the Son of God, creates everything, and then Adam does what he does, and it all goes sideways. And then there's a little conference among the Trinity, and Jesus says, oh, I know. I think that I could actually I think that could work. Let me think about it. Let me do some math, those long equations on the physics board. Yeah. I could take on human. No, it was like that from the beginning. The creator of human body knew he would assume a human body. Important that he rises from the dead bodily, right? That he keeps his body, that he even shows it to people, right? Put your hands in put your finger in my hands and my side, and so forth. So integral, you choosing that word very carefully, not essence of who we are, right? When you die, so to speak, Then your body returns to the dust. That's how you liberate it from the infection of sin. The soul keeps going. There's no downtime for the soul. Spirit animates the soul, right? Which has effects on the body. Okay. So the body is integral, like the materials in the scientist's laboratory are integral. What can a scientist learn if he's in an empty room? Right? It could be a civil engineer, it could be a biologist, a chemist. It doesn't matter. I can't learn anything if I don't have any materials to work with. I need to know how. How do two people know if they love each other? We discover that through the necessities and inner workings of a physical life in a physical world. It is integral. And some of us need to be male and some of us need to be female to experience what this integration, this chemistry of God's creation, what that looks like. But a vast majority of what we are as human beings, not male or female, is the same. Right? Children submit to their parents, right? Congregational members to the pastor, citizens to leader, wives to husbands. Interesting, right? First Corinthians 12, Christ to God. The Son of God submits himself. So if you're not the very first person ever, like God the Father, or the very last person ever, and that would be interesting to know who that'll be, then you're somewhere in the middle of this sequence where you have both sides of the relationship, right? I'm dependent, I'm depended on. So it's not so much fundamentally a gender thing, it's a relationship thing where gender tells me something about my responsibilities in this. Something like that, right? But just like free will, same thing with anthropology. We would need to spend a lot of time helping contemporary people step out of the kind of one-dimensional anthropology that our culture has collapsed into, right? It's going to take a lot of time. Just like you can't really do what Jesus said, whoever loses his life will save it. You can't do that. You can't make sacrifices in your life if you don't have this consciousness of, well, this is a very small moment in forever, right? This is why I'm doing it. This is going somewhere. So I'm willing to make that trade, compared to a person who says, I don't have much time to live. I'm not trading off anything, which is how you get a culture like ours. It's hypersensitive and hypercritical at the same time. Okay. I wanted to look, chapter 3 of Galatians is worth, we could spend a whole semester just on chapter 3, but if you would look at verse 10, the law brings a curse. By the way, I just didn't want to take the time to edit out all of these headings, but let me caution you about that too. Is that Bible with headings can often take the place of you figuring out what that section is about, right? So you read a heading and then you move on, figuring you get it, when maybe you don't. I may have, if I haven't, I should have told you, it's often very helpful to also take out the verses and the chapters in texts. So cut and paste it off the internet, a chunk of Galatians or all of Galatians, but then go through and take out all of the chapters and verses and headings, and so you only have the text, because that's what the Greek manuscripts look like. Same thing with Hebrew. And then you do the formatting of the text. You indent or move things around as the text directs you, and then see what you begin to see, right? Cause and effect, development of arguments, all kinds of things like that. And remember, if you're learning Hebrew and Greek, you can't escape this. It just goes slowly, while you're trying to correctly understand what these texts say in those original languages. what those texts say are settling into your head, right? Well, if you're not working in Hebrew and Greek, you can still do that. When you're working with a text from the Bible and you're pushing the text around on the page to see what the relationship is between parts of the text and how it develops and so forth, that's what you're doing. It's sinking in. The text is in your ears, on your mind, in your heart, and that process will reveal to you what's going on, plus the other tools that you have that will promote that too. Okay. In my experience in counseling, for as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse. How many of you have experienced in your own marriage or relationships, child to parents or as parent to children, or know of someone who you would say this is kind of accurate? This person's experience in family or relationship seems cursed, unhappy, discouraged, depressed. The children that feel like they can never do enough or satisfy the expectations of their parents or their school or it's what's really bad now, their classmates and peers, or what's worse still, the culture around them. It has nothing to do with their life, and yet they feel like they have to compete in that sort of a thing. Husbands and wives that have expectations for each other that can never seem to be met. We can't do that with God. We can't live with God, and we can't do that with each other. So super diagnostic there when we think about relationships. Okay, Galatians 4, Scott, please.
Regarding Galatians 4, well, I am.
It's okay.
Okay. Having trouble determining why or how it can be considered acceptable for a wife to whimsically offer her maidservant to her husband to conceive a child without unraveling the sanctity and order of the entire institution of marriage. Similarly, how am I to understand that any loving, devoted husband could even remotely conceive of offering his wife to an Egyptian ruler as his quote unquote sister in order to save his own hide? What if Paul is using the example of Abram Sarai as an allegorical point to stress the urgency of the churches in Galatia to stick to their guns? I know I need to use more specific language instead of allegories and hyperboles and all that. I'm learning that. Rather than backslide into the law-heavy procedural, administrative, regulatory bureaucracy of the old ways. However, considering Abraham is our father of faith, what kind of an example do he and Sarai set for their descendants? Surely their faith, belief, trust would have precluded them from engaging in these last-ditch schemes to either save their lives or have a baby no matter what. It sounds like I was really upset when I was reading this. So I should have gone back and edited it. If God wanted them to have a child, he would arrange it, which of course he later did, but not until after the Hagar affair. And if God wanted to protect Abraham in Egypt during the flight from famine, surely he would, without Abraham having to pawn his wife to the Pharaoh as his sister! Exclamation point. I'm not sure how to approach a solution strategy for this. Perhaps a look at bondage, free, covenants, flesh, and youngs. Try that first, but even the allegory of the two sons in the Jerusalem in bondage to her children and the Jerusalem which is above is free. I'm not grasping what's being said here. I don't know what I'm missing, but I've read carefully word by word and haven't had the aha light bulb moment at all in this chapter. So
yeah, okay,
yeah,
wonderful.
Kind of spastic.
Okay, thinking first of all about method rather than outcome. Scott has some good suggestions here. Part of the method needs to be to put ourselves back in the the circumstances of when the text was written. For example, we're all familiar with how many of the Disney movies are all about a young lady getting to choose who she's going to marry instead of being forced to marry someone. Okay, I don't think they're making them about that anymore. I think they're finally past that. But geez, okay, it's always has to do, am I in love with him? I don't have to love him, which isn't love at all, really. It's something else. But can we imagine in our culture, can we even imagine a time when conception was it? That was king. Conception was the way forward. If a woman can conceive a child, she has a future and a hope. She has someone coming behind her that's younger than her, that can take care of her, that can maybe make marriages or have a family also, that will build this network of green arcs of support, right? Also to feel like she has something to do with making the future better. Remember was it the Abraham Lincoln quote? The hand that rocks the cradle rules the nation. To recognize that what a woman can do by conception is unparalleled. You can't do it there's no other way to do it. And so what an extraordinary experience to have, and cherished for all sorts of reasons, personal and economic and so forth, right? People don't think like that today. But maybe we could help them think about. Same thing with what people condemn as genocides in the Old Testament. A person would want to spend some time reading about the conduct of certain nations in antiquity, and not that long ago. I mean, you only have to go back to the 1940s, correct? Was there anything going on in the 1940s, 70 years ago, that is unspeakable, that we would absolutely feel like we've got to put a stop to this and make sure it never starts again? But then it shows up. What went on in Rwanda, what went on in Bosnia, it just keeps showing up, right? And so, same thing. And there are narratives in the Old Testament that will help make that evident to you. So, for example, the fella who had the tent peg driven through his head, the enemy of Israel, is that guy's name?
Sisera.
Yeah, Sisera, thank you. Okay, when he doesn't come home, his mother, looking out the window, looking for him to be coming home with his army, and from the victory and all the loot, the money and the clothes and all the wealth, they're going to bring all that home. It's going to be so great, you know. Is it really possible that a woman, Sisera's mother, has no feelings at all for the people that were butchered? I mean, literally butchered and slaughtered. And it gets worse, because when he's late, Sisera's mother comforts herself. She says he's late because there's another woman to rape. That's why he's like, okay, no, I'm going to quit worrying about him because he's fine. What do you do with a person whose mind is like that, right? And so in our culture, we do recognize with this term sociopath, there are people who are they just can't live without doing harm to people around them. Okay, genocide. Something else you learn when you read about what people claim as genocides in the Old Testament is they never actually were. Who came out of Egypt with Israel? Only Israelites? No, lots of people, right? Who shows up with Jesus in the land of Canaan? All kinds of people from all over the place. Rahab the harlot. Just go through the narratives and see. And it's not just like an exception or, oh yeah, by the way, let me just throw you a bone. But it's by example, by ideal, the way Jesus shows a child to the disciples and says, unless you repent and become like a child, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven. So, Scott, I'll grant you, and you could check, there's been a lot of ink spilled over the allegory in Galatians 4. And by the way, Scott, allegory is a word in Galatians 4. There's a Greek word allegory there. Paul says this is allegory, which is just another word for parable or parallel or something like that. But it's a little bit like the book of Revelation. If you're going to understand Galatians 4, you're probably going to need 2, 3, 4 months in the Old Testament, right? Getting your mind around Hagar, Sarah, Egypt, Jerusalem, Absalom, Ishmael. Think about the thing where Ishmael was mocking Isaac, right? The son of the maidservant shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. Okay, so our human nature is conceived of bondage in sin. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of heaven. You see how you start getting these similar languages here. Oh, we're talking about the same thing, right? You can't bring your corrupt human nature with you to heaven, and why would you want to? Okay, the son of the free woman, the whole point is that Abraham and Sarah couldn't have a child. And how do you prove that, right? How do you prove it's on Sarah's side of the equation? Well, you got Abraham and Hagar, and then Abraham has 5 more children with Keturah. So there's a future problem with us, with who we are, that we can't solve for ourselves. What's the solution? A promise from God that causes a conception that's contrary to typical, I don't want to say normal, I want to say typical biological processes. So how else can God prove to us that he can make us new except by making a real person, Isaac, new when that was impossible? That's the beginnings of what's going on there, right? So appreciate what's going on here. Speaking of what's okay and what's not okay, we could have a whole year-long class about that, couldn't we? How is this okay? But I'm not going to give you any examples, or we'll be here till next week. Chloe, anything you want to share with us about anything we should look at in Galatians 5?
Yeah, sorry, I realized I didn't share that with you, did I?
Not that I know of.
No, I'm pretty sure I forgot. Okay, so at the very beginning, where is it? Yeah, very beginning. Stand firm, do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. And then do not be circumcised. Basically, it says do not be circumcised. Christ will be of no value to you at all. Whoever lets himself be circumcised is obligated to obey the whole law. So it's talking about freedom in Christ, but then it has this very like law-like attitude. And then I'm kind of confused because it says do not let yourself be burdened again by a yoke of slavery, because also in the New Testament it mentions, I think in, where was it? In Peter, it says like basically like servants submit to your masters with respect, to the good, the gentle, and the unjust. So that's kind of contradictory there.
Ah, yes, thank you. Good, thanks, Chloe. That's a good tack to pursue. When we look at law throughout the Bible, all of you know the 3 kinds of law in the Old Testament, yes? Right? Ceremonial, civil, moral. Yes, and you understand why we have those divisions of things, correct? The ceremonial law, nobody goes to hell when they die for messing up a ceremonial law, but you're confusing the purpose and the witness of the ceremony when you do that, right? So you want to recognize the purpose of the ceremony. And what was the purpose of the ceremonial law? Twofold, right? It is a drawing, if you will, right? It's the creation of an image in time and space of what God has promised to send us. Who is this Messiah? What does he do? Okay, he substitutes his life for ours. And then you have the contrast, but this substitute, being the Son of God, substitutes himself only once and for everyone. And then also, unlike the ceremonial law and its sacrifices, everything changes, right? And of course, Hebrews is this fantastic commentary on what that was all about. So it looks forward to, it tells you who the Messiah is and what he does, and it keeps impressing upon you the disability of any other human activity to accomplish what he's going to accomplish. It's a perfect, these two forces are at work to keep you in the right place. Okay, civil law, right? It would surprise us, wouldn't it, if a God that created gravity and minerals and materials in the world didn't have something to say about how we conduct ourselves as a material people in a material world. And some of you, let me just check, how many of you would agree that at least in the United States, we seem like we're losing our grasp on how to get along with each other in a civil way, right? Yeah, this is a problem. Okay, and we won't get into that anymore. Okay, and then the moral law, of course, is that this has enduring consequences. Not so much that you go to hell and you must go there irretrievably if you do one of these things, but that doing one of those things and doing those things repeatedly is evidence of a disposition so contrary to God, right, that it cannot benefit from the redemption that God has set in place before the creation of the world. That's how that works. Okay. Something else, stand fast in the liberty for which Christ has set you free. Do you remember I made you that little diagram on one of the slides where it's the law, you read the law one way if you've already been saved and justified, and you're approaching the law now as a kind of a witness to how do I help my neighbor. Right? So remember the drowning thing. If I was drowning and some lifesaver saved me and gave me my life back by putting me back on the shore, right? What would you think of me if I cursed him for doing that and ran back in the water? I insisted I was fine and I don't need you to do that to me, and it was very embarrassing and I'm offended. Right? That's what it seems like to Paul for Jews who were there, who heard Jesus speak, who saw what Jesus did, who know the significance of that, and yet they want to insist on or reassert the requirements of the law in the equation, right? And if you do that, and you probably know this verse from James, whoever fails in one point of the law is guilty of all of it, yes? So I was gonna use submarine because I had a brother pastor in Michigan who was in submarines, but we have Derek here. Derek, if you get one integral significant aspect of flying wrong, how many other things go wrong?
No, it's definitely a chain reaction.
Right, then all the things go wrong. Right. You can't say, well, it was just this little thing. Right?
Yeah, you should have been there a few hours ago when I was on fire in the sim. It was great.
Yeah, I bet. Which, by the way, simulators is kind of off topic, but it has to do with how the law works. I happen to be in Ann Arbor taking driver's ed in a city with lots of money and that like to consider itself on the cutting edge of everything. So we had simulators for driver's ed. So there's a movie playing up front, and we're sitting in what is like the interior of a car with a steering wheel and brakes and all the parts. And this computer is recording how we're driving compared to what's on the movie screen. Now, how long do you suppose it took us sophomore and juniors in high school to figure out that we really didn't care how well or poorly we did in this simulator? So it wasn't that long before I was speeding up just so I could hit a pedestrian, just to see what happens in the machine, you know? And we'd be take it up to 90 and throw it in reverse. We're doing all kinds of stuff. And so they don't have those simulators anymore. So, but to make the point is that when you live in a creation like God's, right, it is all integral. And you do hear naturalists talk about this, don't you? Like in the ecological system, you don't have to mess much up before you get this chain reaction, before all sorts of things are going bad, and how you're gonna recover from that. So it's the same thing if you put yourself back under a system of requirements that never saved anyone and couldn't save anyone. Why would you do that? And what would your excuse be for doing that? It could only be, a ridiculously self-obsessed ego that would do that. And of course, we know what happens to it, the end of that sort of thing. So the whole of Galatians, well, let's look at the end of chapter 5 too. Oh, anyway, what I started all that long, what I said was approaching the law as one already saved, now interested in paying forward the value of that salvation. So I was drowning, I was rescued, I didn't go back in the water, I went forward to swim lessons, to exercise, to all of the kinds of things I could learn as a person not in the water that would allow me to be effective in the water, not just to go swimming, but to save other lives. That's a very different thing. When you're doing that, you're interested in the law because I want to know how this helps me, right? Like what's the purpose of this law in the whole big thing that saves people's lives? As opposed to, I'm required to satisfy what the law requires of me. And my ego won't let me admit that I can't. And so how am I going to read the law now? I'm going to start making adjustments in it, which is, again, that takes us back to many of Jesus' conversations with the religious leaders of his time, especially the Sermon on the Mount, right? You have heard that it was said, love your friend and hate your enemy. No, that's not what it says. Okay, so the first thing Jesus does after the temptations in his public ministry is to reestablish the truth of what the law requires, so that in order to save people from thinking that they can do that on their own. Okay, I think that's a good night, friends. You have the notes. I hope that's helpful. It took me a long time. I hope that you recognize the value of 67 things to know, and not, I was going to go through all of the slides for the whole semester and build an exam, which I think may have been more like 3,000 questions, not 67. So I'm trying to give you the best of, and something that's a sampler, a relative sample of what we've been working on all semester, and to know what that is ahead of time, not have to guess through this whole huge body of content that we've been working on. Yeah, so I explained the rest of what to do and how to do it, and so I'll hear from you between now and next Tuesday, and I'll see you here, unless you're taking the exam during this time. I'll see you here 6:30 next Tuesday. Yes? By the way, friends, I got to meet Scott Wieselman in 3D on Sunday. I was filling in the Lutheran Church in Beverly Hills, and Scott and his wife came, and it was a fantastic experience, at least for me. So thanks for making the effort,
It was awesome.
Scott. Yeah, good.
Fabulous. Yeah, that was great.
Okay, the Lord be with all of you and keep you. I'll see you next week.
Thank you. Good night.
Dr. Eschelbach, is now an okay time to ask you when might be a convenient time to chat?
Absolutely.
How does your Thursday and Friday look?
They look good.
All
Say
right.
when. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Thursday morning, not so good. But afternoon my time and all day Friday, anytime Friday.
Okay. Let's do Friday then.
Friday, what time?
Afternoon sometime?
Give me a number.
Okay. Well, 1 p.m. your time would be 3 p.m. my time, right?
Yep.
Let's do, what about noon your time?
Sure.
Would be 2 p.m. my time.
Done.
All right. I will make a little Google Calendar meet and send it to you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no worries.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Have a good night.
You too. Tyler.
Unmute myself here. Just a couple of housekeeping issues right off the bat. So it's up to us when we take the exam. You're going to forward us the questions and then we
Yep.
work through it and then we grade it together as a class on Tuesday night, I'm guessing.
Nope.
Oh,
You email me when you finished it and I'll send you the key. You grade your own.
Oh, okay. All right. So between that, because just the way my work schedule with family and everything, I was like, I was reserving next week's class time to take it. But if
Nope.
we just email you and you send it to us when we're finished, and we go from there.
You bet. That's why I wanted all of you to have the liberty to see what's your best hour and 50 minutes in the week to come and set that aside for the test.
Got you. Okay. Okay, let's see. Just how long do we have access to the slides and videos and things like that? Because even
the rest
after
of your life.
Okay, perfect. Because I mean, I know the way things exist in the virtual world now. As long as we hang on to that link, we've got it. Because there's so much meat on the bone here. I personally need to spend more time with it, and it's refreshing to have that to come back to, just to help me through life and my growth.
Absolutely. And me too.
Yeah.